The first thing anyone noticed wasn't the bodies. It wasn't the smell. It wasn't even the fact that the storage unit had been sitting there for years, quietly hiding its secrets in a dusty corner of California. No, the first thing anyone noticed was the silence. A silence so thick, it felt like it had weight. You could almost hear it pressing down on the shoulders of the officers as they stepped closer, flashlights cutting through the dim light like knives. And then, in that quiet, someone whispered the words no one expected. "They're in there." But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just 5 minutes ago, the world was normal. People were going about their routines, scrolling through their phones, watching the evening news. But for the team unlocking that storage unit, time had stopped. And what they were about to find would not only shatter their understanding of a high-profile family tragedy, but leave an indelible mark on anyone who heard about it. The question that nobody could answer yet was simple but terrifying. How could something like this remain hidden for so long? Imagine walking into a place you've never thought twice about, expecting the mundane, boxes, furniture, old keepsakes, and instead finding chaos carefully arranged. You see, this wasn't the scene of a break-in or an abandoned unit left to decay. It was staged. Every object, every clue, seemed placed with intention. Whoever had left it here wanted someone to find it. The chilling part? They knew exactly who would. And that realization, even before the first body was identified, caused a shiver to run through everyone in the room. And then they saw it. The first body. It wasn't lying on the floor as if it had fallen or been dropped. No, it was seated, almost upright, as though frozen in mid-action. The position was unnatural, yet deliberate. The eyes, now lifeless, seemed to stare into nothing, but anyone looking closely could swear they were looking at you. A cold recognition ran through the team. They had all been trained for crime scenes, for violence, for situations that made seasoned investigators flinch, but nothing could prepare them for this. Nothing in their experience matched the sense of intimate horror they felt in that instant. And yet, even as they stared, questions began to pile up. Who were these people? How long had they been here? And most importantly, why had no one noticed sooner? The storage unit was in a modest industrial complex, tucked between nondescript buildings, its presence almost invisible from the road. Only someone actively looking for it, or someone who already knew it existed, would find it. It wasn't on any publicly available list. It wasn't tied to any property records. Its existence was, in all practical terms, invisible, and for years, it had been silently holding its secret. The officers exchanged glances, their faces pale in the flashlight beams. There was Romy. She had been the one to call them, insisting that something was wrong. She had spoken in hushed, urgent tones, warning them about a dangerous family member, and saying they should check everything carefully. At the time, her words had seemed like grief talking, or perhaps fear exaggerating the truth. But as they stepped further inside, reality began to validate her warnings in a way that no one could ignore. Every step forward felt like peeling back a layer of a nightmare that had been meticulously constructed over years. And while the scene itself was shocking, the environment added another layer of unease. Dust hung in the air, motes illuminated by the flashlight beams, swirling like tiny phantoms. The faint smell of decay, mingled with something chemical, something deliberately placed to mask or preserve, was almost tangible. There was a stillness to the room, as if time itself had been suspended. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls, filing cabinets perfectly aligned, and then, in the center, the evidence of what Romy had warned about. Two bodies, positioned with an almost ritualistic care, surrounded by objects whose significance would only later be understood. Letters, notebooks, photographs, all hinting at stories that were never meant to be uncovered. You might be wondering, how could anyone keep something like this hidden? The answer is as terrifying as the scene itself. It wasn't just a physical concealment. It was a concealment of memory, of knowledge, of relationships. The bodies in the storage unit weren't just evidence, they were statements. Whoever placed them here wanted someone to find them, but they also wanted to control the narrative, to dictate the story that would be told when discovery finally occurred. And for anyone looking from the outside, it might have seemed like random tragedy. But inside, there was a structure, a logic, and a chilling intelligence guiding it all. As the officers cautiously approached, they began cataloging what they saw. There was no immediate identification, no names attached. Just forms, positions, and a series of small but deliberate markers. A photograph carefully placed on one chest, a handwritten note tucked under a shoulder, a key lying at the feet of the second body. It was as though someone had designed this moment for discovery, ensuring that when it was finally seen, it would provoke fear, confusion, and awe in equal measure. And in that moment, they all realized something important. This wasn't just a storage unit. This was a message. But what did it mean? That was the question hanging over them like a storm cloud ready to break. Every clue seemed contradictory. On one hand, the placement of the bodies and objects suggested care, planning, perhaps even reverence. On the other hand, the evidence of violence, the lifelessness, the decay, screamed of brutality. How could the same scene convey both respect and terror? It was a contradiction that no one could immediately reconcile, and it was the first sign that what they were dealing with went far beyond a simple crime scene. It was a puzzle with pieces that didn't belong together, a story written in contradictions. Even as they tried to make sense of the physical scene, the emotional impact hit. You see, this wasn't just a professional exercise. The people in that unit, Romy included, were tied emotionally to what they were seeing. A family tragedy that had once seemed confined to the walls of a home had now spilled into a neutral, seemingly innocuous space. The private horror that had been trapped in the corners of their lives was now visible, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. And that realization brought another chilling question. If this could happen here, if the hidden death of loved ones could be arranged so carefully and remain unseen for so long, what else might still be hidden? What other secrets had the family been keeping, and who else had been involved? The answers were not immediate. In fact, they wouldn't come for some time. What they did know, even in that first moment of discovery, was this: whatever had happened here was deliberate, methodical, and designed to be discovered at precisely the right time. And that timing, that 5-minute window in which the world changed for everyone involved, would prove to be both the key and the trap. The moment the storage unit door rolled up, nothing would ever be the same again. So, as you watch this story unfold, as you hear about the discoveries, the contradictions, the hidden histories, and the painful secrets, I want you to ask yourself, what would you do if you found a secret this meticulously hidden? Would you confront it? Would you ignore it? Or would you be swept up in a story so strange, so horrific, that the truth seems almost impossible to accept? Because what comes next isn't just about discovery. It's about revelation, betrayal, and a darkness that was carefully stored away, waiting for the right eyes to find it. And those eyes, in this story, belong to the people who never thought they would see it. And then, just as the team was beginning to process the horror, the flashlight beams caught something unexpected. A faint glint, almost hidden in the shadows. It wasn't on the floor, wasn't part of the bodies themselves. It was smaller, subtle, but unmistakably deliberate. And in that moment, everyone realized that the storage unit held more than just the bodies. It held a secret that, if revealed, could unravel everything they thought they knew. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The storage unit shouldn't have existed. That was the first thought that ran through the minds of everyone who stepped onto the cracked concrete lot that cold California morning. From the outside, it looked ordinary, just another row of metal doors, numbers stenciled in fading paint, a flickering light that barely illuminated the strip of asphalt. It was the kind of place people walked past every day without giving it a second thought. Yet here they were, staring at a door that shouldn't have been there, at least not in the way it was registered. Records didn't match up. Ownership didn't match up. In fact, someone had gone to great lengths to erase the unit's trail entirely. Romy had insisted. "Check everything," she had said. Her voice had been tight, almost desperate, when she called it in. There's something there. Something dangerous. At the time, it seemed like grief speaking. After all, the tragedy at the Brentwood estate had been raw, chaotic, and incomprehensible. But grief doesn't give instructions with this level of precision. Grief doesn't know about erased records, or locks changed without explanation, or the faint smell of chemicals that clung to the air even outside the unit. And yet, here it was, the storage unit, quiet, waiting. The officers exchanged glances. One of them, a veteran with over 20 years in homicide, ran his fingers along the faded metal door. He could feel the cold, the weight of the lock, the faint vibration of something concealed behind it. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The unit had been registered under a shell corporation that had dissolved years ago. The paperwork had been meticulously scrubbed. Only someone with inside knowledge, or someone looking for it with relentless determination, would have found it. And now, standing there in the harsh morning light, everyone felt the unnerving sense that they were walking into someone else's carefully controlled world. The lock clicked under the officer's wrench. There was a shudder, a metallic groan, and then the door rolled up with a hiss. Dust puffed into the air like smoke from an unseen fire. The first thing they saw weren't the bodies, it was the silence. Absolute silence. Not the quiet of a room, not the peaceful hush that comes at night. This was something heavier, something that pressed against the chest like a hand refusing to let go. And then they saw the first clue that this unit had been designed to be found, not stumbled upon by accident. Boxes lined the walls, stacked to the ceiling in perfect order. They were labeled with dates, with initials, with cryptic codes. Some were dusty, some pristine, as though some had been touched yesterday. Filing cabinets stood in a corner, their drawers closed but clearly not locked. And in the middle of the room, well, that's when the officers realized there was nothing middling about what they were about to witness. Everything else in the unit seemed to revolve around one focal point. A position that drew the eye like a gravitational pull. And there, at the center, sat the first body. It was carefully placed. The position was unnatural, deliberate. One arm stretched slightly forward, the other folded neatly across the lap. Clothing intact, albeit marred by time and faint traces of fluid that made no sense yet. The eyes, though closed, seemed painted with awareness. The first officer to step forward froze. Years of experience told him to keep moving, to catalog, to photograph. But something about this body, the positioning, the aura of intent, made him hesitate. Whoever had left it here wanted someone to see it, wanted someone to notice. And the more he stared, the more he realized the room was speaking, whispering a story in symbols he didn't yet understand. There were papers around the body, small scraps, some handwritten, others typed. The handwriting was precise, controlled, almost obsessive in its neatness. Each sheet hinted at a narrative, a timeline, a ledger of sorts. But nothing was immediately understandable. Names were crossed out, numbers were circled, and there was one element that chilled the team to the bone. The papers weren't just records. They were messages. Someone had designed this discovery to send a direct line to the people who would find it. Whoever placed these bodies here had not only anticipated discovery, they had anticipated reaction. The smell hit next. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It was a combination of decay and preservation, of chemicals used for cleaning, masking, or delaying decomposition. It mingled with dust and the faint, almost imperceptible scent of old wood. For the team, it was a sensory warning. Whatever had happened here was deliberate, and it had been done with knowledge. Knowledge of bodies, of time, of concealment. And it had been hidden in plain sight for years, under the noses of anyone who might have noticed. Romy stood just behind them, her face pale but resolute. She had insisted this unit was connected to her family's tragedy, but even she hadn't anticipated the depth of the horror she was about to confront. As the officers began to document the scene, Romy's eyes flicked to every box, every drawer, every shadow. She recognized certain items, not all, but enough to confirm that this wasn't random. Some of the boxes contained financial records she remembered from childhood. Some held personal belongings that had long been considered lost. And yet, the presence of the bodies transformed these mundane items into something terrifying. Ordinary life had become extraordinary in its danger. One officer found a key lying on the floor near the first body. It was old, ornate, and out of place among the metal and cardboard. Another officer picked up a photograph, faded but intact. It depicted the Brentwood estate, though the date stamped on it suggested it had been taken long before the murders everyone knew about. Someone had gone to painstaking effort to place these items in this unit. Each piece a clue, each piece a statement. And as they looked closer, they realized there was a pattern, a structure to the chaos. This wasn't just a storage unit. It was a narrative constructed in real space, a story told in objects and positioning, a puzzle designed to test whoever opened the door. Questions surged faster than answers could come. Who had placed the bodies here? How long had they been hidden? Why now? And perhaps most importantly, what message was being sent? Every glance at the arrangement suggested intelligence, intentionality, and an almost cruel understanding of human psychology. The unit itself became a character, a presence that seemed to breathe around them, watching as they tried to decipher its meaning. The walls, the boxes, the bodies, they all formed a network of information that could only be interpreted by someone willing to pay attention to the smallest detail. As the team worked, cataloging, photographing, and attempting to identify the first body, the silence became heavier still. There were no sounds of movement beyond their own breaths. No hum of nearby traffic, no birdsong. Even the dust seemed suspended in the air. It was as though the storage unit had been waiting, holding its secret in a delicate balance, until the exact right people arrived. And now here they were. The past and the present collided in this small, unremarkable place. And what they would uncover next would make every earlier assumption about the tragedy seem incomplete, naive, or downright wrong. Then came the second body. Hidden just out of the corner of the first body's field, positioned in shadow but unmistakably present. This body was different, slightly smaller, perhaps, or younger. The pose was eerily symmetrical with the first, almost as if the two were in dialogue with one another. Here again were objects, a notebook tucked under an arm, another photograph laid across the chest. The pattern was clear, and yet the meaning remained opaque. Whoever had done this had considered visibility, interpretation, and shock value. They had staged, curated, and controlled even the horror. Romy gasped softly. It was a sound that pierced the quiet, a tiny human reminder of what they were all facing. She recognized the clothing. Maybe she recognized the face, although decomposition had rendered identification difficult. But there was no mistaking the intention behind the arrangement. Someone was sending a message. A warning, a confession, or a declaration. And whatever it was meant to reach someone who would understand, someone who could read between the lines of blood, paper, and shadow. For a moment, no one spoke. Time slowed. Every officer, every person in that storage unit, felt the weight of what had been kept secret. They had entered expecting paperwork, boxes, and maybe a few personal effects. Instead, they found lives interrupted, meticulously arranged, and carefully concealed. And as they began to theorize, to speculate, to ask questions, they realized the scope of what they had uncovered could extend far beyond this single unit. It might implicate family members, business partners, friends, anyone who had access to these secrets over the years. The web was wider, more tangled, and far darker than anyone had imagined. And then the first officer spoke, barely above a whisper. This wasn't hidden for nothing. The words hung in the air, a stark acknowledgement that the storage unit was more than a container. It was a stage, a message, and a puzzle all at once. The story it held would not be easy to read, and its implications would reverberate through every corner of a family already shattered by tragedy. But what came next would change everything, and no one was prepared for the revelations still waiting in the shadows of that unassuming metal door. The first body was unlike anything the officers had ever seen. Not because of the manner of death, though that would soon become terrifyingly clear, but because of the presence it carried. It wasn't lying like a careless accident. It wasn't slumped in a corner as though tossed aside. No, this body had been positioned with care, precision, almost as if it were meant to convey something. And in that frozen stillness, in the eerie calm of the storage unit, the team felt it looking at them. Not literally, of course, but in that moment, it felt alive. It demanded recognition, demanded understanding, demanded attention. Romy, standing just behind the officers, swallowed hard. She could barely breathe. She had been here before, in a sense, haunted by memories of family, by suspicions, by fears she had long buried. But nothing prepared her for the visceral reality of seeing death curated in such a deliberate way. Her hands trembled slightly, and she forced herself to take a step forward. She needed to see, to confirm, to confront. The body's clothing was intact, although faint stains hinted at time, decay, and what could only be described as calculated brutality. It wasn't immediately identifiable. There was no ID, no wallet, no tags. The face was pale, waxy, and the eyes, though closed, carried the haunting suggestion of recognition. It was as if the body itself knew it was being observed. The officers documented everything meticulously, snapping photograph after photograph, but there was a lingering sense that some truths couldn't be captured by a camera. Some truths demanded interpretation, intuition, and courage. The smell came next, a subtle but unmistakable warning. It was the scent of decay, yes, but mingled with chemicals, something deliberately used, either to preserve or disguise. Whoever had left this body here had knowledge of biology, of decomposition, of timing. They had planned every detail, down to how the first person to enter the unit would react to the smell, the visual impact, the horror. Every choice had been intentional. Nothing was random. Romy noticed the small objects surrounding the body almost immediately. A photograph, faded but still legible, lay across the chest. Its edges were worn, but the image captured a location that made her stomach turn: the Brentwood estate. The photo's date suggested it had been taken years before the tragedy that had engulfed her family. Someone had anticipated that this photograph would be found. Someone wanted the connection to be made immediately. A notebook, tucked carefully under the body's arm, contained pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Lines crossed out, numbers circled, names partially erased. Whoever wrote it had intended the reader to decipher it, but not too easily. It was a message wrapped in ambiguity, a code of grief, warning, and accusation all at once. And though no one could yet understand its full meaning, everyone felt its weight pressing down on them. The officers worked in tense silence, exchanging occasional whispers. "This is staged," one finally said. "Every movement, every placement, it's deliberate." The veteran officer nodded, unwilling to add anything more. Words felt inadequate. They had expected boxes, perhaps a forgotten couch, a filing cabinet or two. They hadn't expected life and death orchestrated like a tableau, a statement, a confession. As Romy stepped closer, she recognized something in the body's clothing. A jacket she remembered from a family photograph, a scarf she had seen folded neatly in a drawer years ago, a ring that seemed familiar, though tarnished and dull from time. These were personal items, intimate and specific, and their presence made the horror personal. The abstract shock of discovering a body somewhere else didn't compare to seeing a loved one, or someone tied to your family, arranged like this. And yet, the body remained anonymous enough to conceal its identity, an impossible balance of recognition and secrecy. Questions piled up faster than answers. How long had this body been here? Why had no one noticed earlier? The storage unit's records showed no history of complaints, no reports of foul smells, no inspections. And yet, here it was, perfectly preserved in its own curated hell. Someone had planned this, carefully, for reasons no one could yet understand. Then came the first clues to the manner of death. At first, it was subtle. Faint discoloration on the neck, a shadow of injury along the torso. Then, as the team examined more closely, it became undeniable: multiple sharp force injuries. The body hadn't just been hidden, it had been killed, deliberately, violently. Homicide. Murder. The word echoed silently in the minds of everyone present. Romy stepped back, her hand to her mouth. She had imagined tragedy, yes, but not this. Not the cold, deliberate, staged display of violence that now confronted her. And the most terrifying part? Whoever had done this had planned for discovery, had chosen this exact moment, this exact sequence of eyes, hands, and flashes of light. Someone had been waiting for them to find it. The body also bore signs of careful manipulation post-mortem. Limbs positioned just so, items placed in specific spots, the notebook and photograph arranged deliberately. It wasn't just concealment, it was choreography. Someone had taken time to create a scene that communicated power, control, and intent. And in the shadows of the storage unit, that intent radiated like a warning. The investigators began cataloging evidence, but every new detail only added to the confusion and fear. A key, placed at the feet of the body, didn't appear to fit any known lock in the unit. Small symbols drawn on paper hinted at locations, dates, perhaps even future plans. There was intention here, but the full message was unclear. Whoever had left the body wasn't just killing, they were communicating. And that communication carried a weight that everyone could feel pressing down on their chest, making it hard to breathe. As Romy looked on, she felt a strange combination of grief and realization. The body wasn't just evidence of death. It was evidence of secrecy, of betrayal, of hidden dynamics within a family she had trusted, loved, and feared. Whoever had orchestrated this understood relationships, understood fear, understood the way people respond to horror. This was intimate knowledge turned into physical manifestation, and that intimacy made it all the more terrifying. Then, something subtle caught the officer's eye, a faint movement of paper in the breeze created by the opening of the unit door. He reached down and discovered a note tucked beneath the first body's hand. It was short, but chilling. Not everything is what it seems. The handwriting was elegant, controlled, almost mocking in its precision. It was the first direct message from the orchestrator of this scene. And in that instant, the team realized that the first body was only the beginning. Because if the first body was meant to communicate, then the second, third, and possibly fourth would build upon it. And whatever the total message was, it would change everything they thought they knew about the family, the tragedy at the estate, and the secrets that had remained hidden for years. Romy's eyes were drawn back to the body. Despite the horror, despite the shock, she noticed details she hadn't at first. A bracelet on the wrist, slightly askew. A small emblem stitched into the jacket lining. A thread pulled from the sleeve. Each detail was a breadcrumb, left deliberately for someone who could recognize its meaning. Whoever had created this scene had knowledge not just of physical logistics, but of emotional triggers. They understood fear, grief, recognition, and expectation. As the officers worked, photographing, measuring, and documenting, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed. Not literally, perhaps, but by the mind that had crafted this scene. Every choice in the unit, the angles, the positioning, the objects, felt designed to provoke exactly the reactions they were having. And that realization brought an added layer of unease. They weren't just discovering the body. They were participating in a conversation with a ghost, or with a living mind that remained hidden, controlling the narrative even from a distance. And then, the most terrifying moment, the realization that the body might not be alone. The positioning of the first body suggested balance, symmetry, the possibility of others. A glance to the side confirmed it. Shadow in the corner, forms just beyond immediate recognition, hints of what would be discovered next. The first body had been the opening statement. What came after would be the punchline, and no one was ready for it. The first body was more than evidence. It was a warning, a message, a puzzle. And in that small storage unit, standing in the cold light, the team understood that their discovery was only the beginning of a story that would unravel years of hidden truths, betrayals, and calculated horror. But what came next, the second body, hidden just out of sight, would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The second body was harder to find, not because it was hidden with extraordinary cunning, but because the mind wasn't prepared to process it. After the shock of the first body, the brain wants patterns, explanations, neat resolutions. It seeks logic. But the second body defied logic. It wasn't lying where one might expect a second victim to be. It wasn't hidden in shadow, waiting for discovery. No. It was positioned intentionally, symmetrically opposite the first body, in a way that suggested communication, conversation, or confrontation. And that placement, almost artistic in its precision, began to fracture every assumption the officers had made about what had happened in this storage unit. Romy's breath caught as she saw it. She recognized elements in the second body, too. The clothing, a bracelet, a familiar pendant. This wasn't a stranger. The first body had been shocking enough, but the second body made it personal. Now the tragedy was no longer abstract. It was embedded in her history, her memories, and the unspoken tensions that had always existed within her family. And the most disturbing realization of all was this: the timeline didn't fit. The first body, from preliminary forensic analysis, had shown signs of death that suggested it had been in the unit longer than the other. Minor decomposition, subtle changes in color, the faint curling of hair, It all pointed to an earlier demise. The second body, however, appeared fresher. And yet, there were clues suggesting it had been killed at approximately the same time as the first, or at least within a narrow window. For investigators, this was a contradiction that defied standard reasoning. Two bodies, one timeline that didn't make sense, deaths apparently separated by days or even weeks, and yet positioned together as though they were part of a single statement. The room seemed to tighten around them. Every officer, every responder, felt it. The impossible chronology was a psychological weapon. Whoever had orchestrated this scene understood the human mind's need for narrative, for cause and effect. They had disrupted it. They had thrown time out of order, forcing those who looked at the bodies to question not just what they saw, but what they thought they knew about reality itself. Boxes, filing cabinets, and scattered objects only added to the confusion. Documents surrounding the second body suggested financial activity that overlapped with events supposedly long past. Receipts, invoices, notes scribbled in the margins of spreadsheets. All of it implied movement, action, life, even after death. It was a paradox that made every logical explanation crumble. Was this evidence of posthumous manipulation? Or had someone been operating behind the scenes, ensuring that certain threads of the story were left intact for later discovery? The placement of objects around the second body was equally deliberate. A notebook rested against one knee, its cover slightly ajar, revealing entries that hinted at secrets long buried. A photograph lay on the chest, depicting the Brentwood estate once more, but this time in a different season, a different light, a different context. There was a subtle message embedded in the details, the same space, yet a different story. Whoever had left it here wasn't just arranging bodies. They were crafting a narrative that unfolded across space and time, daring anyone who entered to decipher it. Romy's mind raced. She remembered conversations, disputes, tensions, arguments that had once seemed trivial. Now, in the context of the second body, they gained weight, significance, and ominous intent. Details she had dismissed as childish quarrels suddenly seemed prophetic. The first body had been the opening act. The second body was the exposition, revealing the underlying conflict, the hidden motives, the unspoken threats that had existed for years within her family. And as horrifying as that realization was, it was accompanied by another. There could be more. The officers began comparing notes, measuring the distance between the bodies, the angle of their limbs, the direction their heads faced. Each measurement suggested intention, careful choreography, a story told in physical form. The symmetry of the second body to the first was undeniable, head tilted slightly toward the other, eyes closed, limbs arranged with purpose. And yet, the contrasts were equally significant. The second body appeared to be younger, smaller, lighter, its expression more serene, almost defiant. Whoever had staged this wanted the observer to notice both the similarities and the differences, to see the tension, the balance, and the unresolved questions that hovered between them. Then there was the matter of identification. Preliminary scans, fingerprints, and DNA sampling would eventually reveal who these individuals were. But the immediate impression was enough to unsettle everyone. These weren't strangers. Their connection to the family, their shared history, their shared fate, all of it was palpable in the way the bodies were arranged. And the contradictions in the timeline only heightened the mystery. How could two people die at separate times, yet appear together as if their deaths were simultaneous? The question lingered in the air, heavy, insistent, impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the bodies themselves. The second body bore additional clues that suggested manipulation after death. Clothing was adjusted, positioning altered, items placed strategically to create visual symmetry with the first. Small details, a turned wrist, a folded corner of a sleeve, the alignment of objects, spoke of someone who cared deeply about presentation, who understood the psychology of discovery. This was no random act of violence. It was an orchestrated statement, a calculated message delivered years after the initial acts of cruelty. Romy felt the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders. Memories she had long suppressed surged forward. Conversations she had thought trivial now seemed like warnings, instructions, or threats. Faces of relatives and friends flashed in her mind, each evaluated anew in light of this tableau. And as the officers continued to document the scene, she realized something terrifying. This storage unit wasn't just a hiding place for bodies. It was a stage, a message, a record, and perhaps even a confession. Every detail, the placement of the bodies, the objects, the symmetry, was deliberate, and the orchestrator had anticipated their discovery, had counted on the reactions it would provoke. The timeline contradictions became the central focus of their analysis. Notes in the second body's notebook referenced dates that conflicted with what forensic science would later establish. Receipts indicated activity after the first death. Objects in the unit, when cross-referenced with shipping and banking records, suggested movement that shouldn't have been possible. And yet, here it all was, meticulously arranged to suggest coherence. The observers were forced to navigate a mental maze designed to confuse, mislead, and control. As they stood there, trying to reconcile the impossible, one officer muttered under his breath, "This doesn't add up. Nothing adds up." But the veteran next to him only nodded. He had seen enough to know that sometimes things don't add up because someone wants them not to. And in that small storage unit, with two bodies perfectly staged, documents scattered with intention, and objects placed for maximum psychological impact, the message was clear. Someone had controlled the narrative from the very beginning. And yet, the full implications had not yet emerged. Forensic analysis would take time. Identification would take longer. But already, the room thrummed with tension. The timeline contradictions were more than a technical detail. They were a psychological weapon, designed to destabilize, confuse, and provoke fear. The first body had delivered shock. The second body delivered uncertainty, a creeping dread that left no one confident in what they thought they knew. Finally, Romy stepped back, her eyes flicking between the two bodies. She could see the connections, the echoes, the interplay of life and death, past and present. The contradictions were not accidental. The timeline didn't fit because someone had chosen it that way, manipulating perception, memory, and expectation. And as the team began to understand the scale of what they had uncovered, one thought crystallized in everyone's mind. The story was far from over. Because if two bodies could exist in this impossible timeline, what else had been hidden? How many secrets remained locked away, waiting for the right person, the right moment, to discover them? And what came next, the third revelation, the next twist, the final piece of the puzzle, would shatter every assumption the team had made. The second body wasn't just a continuation of the horror. It was an escalation, a deliberate intensification of the mystery. And no one was prepared for what would follow. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Romy's voice had been soft when she first spoke to the police, almost hesitant, almost apologetic. "There's something wrong," she had said. "Someone dangerous. Someone who shouldn't be ignored." At the time, the words had seemed like grief, like fear wrapped in the chaos of losing her parents. But as the storage unit doors rolled up and the first bodies were revealed, it became terrifyingly clear that Romy's warnings were not only prescient, they were essential. Revisiting her statement now, in the harsh light of reality, was like reading a diary from another life. Every word, every hesitation, every pause had been a breadcrumb. She had mentioned a family member without naming them, a shadow figure within the family, someone whose presence always carried tension. Her police interview, once skimmed over by investigators eager to process the scene, suddenly took on a new weight. Every detail mattered. Every inflection suggested knowledge of what might be uncovered. Romy had described this person as dangerous, using the word more than once. She had stressed the need for caution, even while grappling with her own grief. "Please, check everything," she had said. I can't explain, but you have to check." At the time, officers had nodded, recording her words, but the scale of what they were about to face made the initial caution seem almost naive. Romy had understood the risk. She had understood the complexity. And now, the storage unit confirmed that her instincts had been correct. The significance of Romy's statement wasn't just in what she said, it was in what she didn't say. She had deliberately avoided names, avoided specifics, avoided pointing directly at the orchestrator of this horror. That silence, combined with her insistence that something was being hidden, formed the skeleton of the warning. Investigators, piecing together the scene and her prior interview, realized that her hesitation was a signal, a subtle alert that the truth was more complicated than anyone had imagined. Romy had also described patterns of behavior she had noticed over the years. Late-night phone calls, financial transactions that didn't make sense, unexplained disappearances of certain personal items. At the time, these details were dismissed as ordinary family oddities, the small quirks and anomalies that families often ignore. But with the discovery of the storage unit, these quirks became clues, pieces of a larger puzzle that hinted at premeditation, concealment, and a hidden narrative spanning years. The emotional weight of her statement became clear when one of the investigators read it aloud in the storage unit. "This isn't just about what's here," he said, voice trembling slightly. "It's about what's been hidden for years." And the team began to piece together that the storage unit was not an isolated act. It was a culmination of secrets, decisions, and manipulations that Romy had long sensed but could never articulate fully. Her interview was a map, her fear a compass, and the storage unit was the destination. Romy's insight had also hinted at the level of danger involved. She had said that the family member in question was clever, careful, and capable of hiding things for years. At the time, these words had seemed like conjecture. But now, examining the precise choreography of the bodies, the deliberate placement of objects, and the contradictions in the timeline, it was clear that she had been describing the methodical intelligence behind the scene. The person responsible had anticipated discovery, controlled perception, and designed the narrative for maximum effect. Romy had recognized this danger instinctively. Her statement also included cryptic references to documents and personal items, things that had gone missing or been altered. She had mentioned ledgers, letters, photographs, and other materials that seemed inconsequential at the time. But with the storage unit now open, investigators realized that these items were the scaffolding of the entire crime. They were both evidence and message. Whoever had arranged this scene had taken care to integrate the objects with the bodies, creating a tableau that communicated across time, space, and familial memory. Romy had understood this integration intuitively. One striking detail in her interview was her insistence on the chronology of events. She had described nights and days with almost obsessive precision, noting anomalies, unexplained absences, and moments that didn't align with public perception. Now, with the timeline contradictions evident in the bodies, it became clear that she had been documenting, mentally, the inconsistencies long before they became apparent to anyone else. Her awareness of these discrepancies suggested a deep understanding of the family's internal dynamics and the hidden forces that had orchestrated the tragedy. Romy's statement also revealed her own fears, her protective instincts, and her emotional resilience. She had been careful to shield her own involvement while still signaling the urgency of the situation. In her words, investigators could detect both courage and caution, a duality that reflected her awareness of the stakes. She knew that revealing too much could put her at risk, but staying silent could allow the danger to persist. Her statement, therefore, was a balancing act, warning without accusation, guidance without exposure. As the team pieced together her observations, it became evident that Romy's statement was a roadmap to understanding the storage unit. Every word she had spoken, every hesitation, every nuance, now had context. The bodies, objects, and arrangements in the unit corresponded to the elements she had alluded to. The contradictions in the timeline, the deliberate positioning, the selection of objects, all were aligned with the warnings she had given. It was as if she had spoken directly to the investigators' future selves, knowing that they would need her insight to make sense of the chaos. Yet even with this clarity, there was unease. Romy had warned them about someone dangerous, someone capable of orchestrating this level of concealment. And now, standing in the storage unit, the investigators realized that the danger might still be present. Whoever had arranged this scene had anticipated discovery, but had they anticipated Romy's insight? Had they accounted for her warnings to the authorities? The possibility that the orchestrator was watching, waiting, or even manipulating from afar created a chilling tension. The past and present, discovery and concealment, were colliding in real time. Romy's statement also shed light on the emotional impact of the tragedy. She had described moments of tension, subtle conflicts, and unspoken fears that now resonated with the evidence before them. The bodies were not just victims of physical violence. They were symbols of the emotional and psychological dynamics that had shaped the family. Romy's ability to articulate these dynamics, even partially, provided crucial insight into the motivations, methods, and mindset behind the orchestration. As the investigators absorbed the significance of her words, a new layer of the mystery emerged. Romy had implied that the storage unit contained more than just the bodies. She had hinted at documents, objects, and evidence that would illuminate hidden motives, long-forgotten disputes, and manipulations that spanned years. And indeed, as they explored the unit further, they began to uncover these additional elements: ledgers, letters, and photographs meticulously placed to guide interpretation. Romy had known, in a way that only someone intimately connected to the family could, that these items would complete the story, but only if approached with care. Her statement concluded with a plea that had seemed vague at the time, but now took on profound clarity. Please, look carefully. Don't overlook anything. Some things are not what they seem. Those words were no longer abstract advice. They were a literal directive. Every box, every photograph, every document in the unit demanded scrutiny. Each detail could reveal a hidden truth, a concealed relationship, or an element of premeditation. Romy's foresight had prepared them for a discovery that would otherwise have been overwhelming, perhaps even incomprehensible. The gravity of revisiting her statement became fully apparent when the investigators realized that Romy had, in essence, predicted the discovery of the bodies. Her references to a dangerous family member, to anomalies, and to hidden items all aligned with the evidence before them. Her foresight was not merely emotional intuition. It was informed observation, careful memory, and an acute understanding of the family's history. And it was this foresight that allowed the team to approach the scene with both caution and comprehension. Even with all this insight, questions remained. Who had orchestrated this scene? How had they maintained secrecy for so long? And why had Romy been the one to sound the alarm, while others in the family remained silent or complicit? The answers were not yet clear, but her statement provided the framework for understanding the unfolding horror. It was the lens through which the storage unit could be interpreted, and without it, the scene might have been incomprehensible, a jumble of bodies and objects lacking meaning. Romy's statement revisited was not merely a transcript of her initial interview. It was a key to decoding the sequence, the placement, and the psychological intent behind the first and second bodies. Every word she had spoken, every pause, every implied warning, now had purpose. And as the investigators cataloged her observations alongside the physical evidence, they began to see a coherent narrative emerge. One that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone perceptive enough to recognize its significance. But even with all this clarity, the shadow of uncertainty remained. Romy had warned of danger, and danger, they realized, was far from neutralized. The orchestrator of this scene was still unknown, still potentially watching, still capable of influencing events from the shadows. Her statement, while illuminating, was also a reminder. The story was far from over. And as they prepared to move deeper into the unit, examining objects, notes, and the subtle arrangements that Romy had hinted at, the investigators understood that the real revelations were just beginning. The first two bodies were only the opening act. The timeline, the motives, the hidden connections, they were all still waiting to be uncovered. But what came next, the third set of clues hidden within the storage unit, would upend everything they thought they knew about the family, the tragedy, and the dangerous person Romy had warned about. No one was prepared for what they were about to find. Every family has secrets. Some are small, hidden debts, whispered arguments, a disagreement that never fully resolves. Others are larger, buried so deep that even those who live alongside them sense only shadows, hints, fleeting moments of unease. But in the Reiner family, there was one member who carried a presence so potent, so carefully concealed, that few dared speak their name aloud. That person existed at the intersection of love, loyalty, and fear, shaping the family from the shadows, while leaving almost no trace of their influence, until now. Romy had alluded to this person in her initial statement to the authorities. "There's someone dangerous," she had said. "Someone who should be considered." At the time, the words seemed vague. Grief-stricken family members often speak in generalities, fearing the consequences of specificity. But the storage unit, with its meticulously arranged bodies and deliberately positioned objects, made it clear that Romy had been pointing to the orchestrator of the horror long before anyone had suspected the full scope. This family member was no bystander. They were central to the narrative, and the evidence suggested they had been calculating, patient, and utterly meticulous. Investigators began to trace the subtle threads of influence this person had wielded over the years. Financial records hinted at transactions that could only have been approved or manipulated by someone with deep access to the family's affairs. Letters, emails, and phone logs revealed a pattern of monitoring, guidance, and, occasionally, coercion. This person had been observing, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly, ensuring that secrets remained hidden, reputations intact, and actions carefully choreographed. And the storage unit was their magnum opus, the culmination of years of concealment, planning, and psychological manipulation. The first two bodies in the unit, as chilling as they were, told only part of the story. Each object, each photograph, each carefully positioned item seemed to point toward the influence of this unseen family member. There were markings on documents that suggested prior knowledge, intentional edits, and instructions meant for eyes that could understand. The key found at the first body's feet wasn't just a random object. It was a symbol of access and control, a signal that someone had not only orchestrated the deaths, but had designed the discovery itself. Whoever this family member was, they had anticipated reactions, guided perceptions, and created an intricate web of cause and effect. Romy's own knowledge of this person added depth to the investigation. She had grown up observing behaviors, noting patterns, feeling unease she couldn't articulate. There had always been an air of tension around them, a sense that nothing was entirely spontaneous when this individual was involved. Family gatherings, financial decisions, even the smallest disagreements had been influenced by this shadow figure. Romy's intuition, honed over years of observation and subtle recognition, had identified them as a source of danger before the rest of the family, or the authorities, could connect the dots. Investigators studied the storage unit with this context in mind. The bodies were only one layer of the narrative. Surrounding them were letters, notebooks, photographs, and objects that all bore signs of careful manipulation. Some contained references to past disputes, hidden debts, or secret meetings. Others included clues about timelines, people's whereabouts, and even future intentions. Each piece of evidence suggested a person deeply involved in the orchestration of events, someone who had influenced lives long before the deaths became a reality. It became clear that this family member's influence extended beyond the immediate tragedy. They had not only manipulated actions, but had also controlled the narrative, ensuring that critical events, disputes, and secrets remained hidden. This level of foresight suggested a mind attuned to strategy, capable of anticipating human behavior with precision. It wasn't just about concealment. It was about shaping perception, crafting a story, and dictating how it would be discovered. Romy's recollections of this individual painted a portrait of complexity. On the surface, they were charming, seemingly loyal, and capable of warmth and generosity. But beneath that veneer was a mind capable of manipulation, coercion, and careful orchestration. Family members who had come into contact with them often felt a strange mixture of affection and fear, a sense that any misstep could have unforeseen consequences. And in hindsight, Romy realized that many of the small oddities she had observed over the years, the missing letters, the altered documents, the subtle shifts in family dynamics, were all traces of this person's influence. The storage unit itself became a lens through which to understand this family member's methodology. Every element, the placement of bodies, the symmetry of objects, the chronological contradictions, reflected a deep understanding of psychology. This was someone who understood fear, curiosity, grief, and expectation. They had designed the discovery to provoke exactly the reactions Romy and the authorities experienced. In effect, they had written a story in physical form, a narrative that demanded attention, interpretation, and emotional engagement. It was also apparent that this person had been aware of Romy's perceptiveness. The warnings in her statement, the guidance she provided to the authorities, and the subtle emphasis on careful observation all suggested that the orchestrator knew Romy could see through the layers of concealment. This added a chilling dimension to the case. The storage unit was not only a crime scene, but also a conversation between the orchestrator and the person they had underestimated, the one who could unravel their carefully constructed narrative. Investigators began to map the connections between the family member and the events leading up to the tragedy. Each detail suggested intentionality, the timing of certain actions, the manipulation of relationships, and the subtle control exerted over family decisions. It became evident that this individual had played a pivotal role in shaping the circumstances that led to the deaths. Far from being a passive figure, they were a central architect of the sequence of events, operating from the shadows, while leaving evidence of their influence scattered throughout the family's history. The emotional complexity of this revelation weighed heavily on Romy. Identifying this individual as a source of danger and manipulation brought a mixture of relief and terror. On one hand, understanding who was responsible provided clarity, a framework for interpreting the tragedy. On the other hand, it confirmed her deepest fears. The danger was personal, intimate, and closer than anyone had imagined. The realization that someone within the family could orchestrate such events with precision, foresight, and patience was almost impossible to reconcile with the outward appearance of normalcy she had observed for so many years. The officers noted the consistency between Romy's prior warnings and the evidence within the storage unit. Her references to a dangerous family member, her insistence on careful examination, and her recognition of anomalies all aligned with the physical evidence. The orchestrator's fingerprints, both literal and metaphorical, were evident in the meticulous arrangement of bodies, the placement of documents, and the contradictions embedded in the timeline. Romy's insight had provided a guide through the chaos, allowing investigators to see patterns that might otherwise have been overlooked. Yet despite this clarity, the mystery deepened. The storage unit contained more than just the bodies and documents. It held subtle messages intended to provoke thought, elicit fear, and manipulate perception. The family member's influence extended beyond the immediate crime, hinting at a broader strategy, a long-term plan that had remained hidden for years. And as investigators pieced together these elements, they realized that understanding this individual's motivations, methods, and psychology would be essential to fully comprehending the tragedy. The most unsettling aspect of this revelation was the potential for ongoing influence. Whoever this family member was, their intelligence, patience, and understanding of human behavior suggested they could continue to manipulate events, even from a distance. The storage unit was not merely a record of past actions. It was a message, a demonstration of capability, and a warning. Romy's statement had provided the key to interpreting these signals, but the threat itself remained present, an invisible force shaping perception and guiding reactions. In revisiting Romy's insights, investigators began to appreciate the depth of her awareness. She had sensed the orchestrator's influence long before it became evident in physical form. She had understood patterns, anticipated danger, and provided warnings without directly naming the individual. Her observations were not just emotional responses. They were informed, analytical, and deeply perceptive. The storage unit and its contents now validated her perspective, confirming that her intuitions had been accurate and that her guidance was essential to understanding the unfolding horror. The presence of this family member also raised questions about motive. Why orchestrate such a scene? Why manipulate timelines, position bodies, and create a narrative in physical form? Investigators speculated that it was not merely about concealment or control. It was about sending a message, asserting dominance, and demonstrating power. The storage unit was a stage, and this individual was both playwright and director, crafting a story that would shock, confuse, and ultimately dominate the perceptions of those who discovered it. As they continued to examine the evidence, one conclusion became undeniable. The family member Romy had alluded to was central to the tragedy, not tangential. They were intimately involved in the orchestration, aware of the sequence of events, and capable of manipulating outcomes with precision. Understanding this individual, mapping their influence, recognizing their methods, and interpreting their subtle cues would be key to solving the mystery. And yet, Despite all the evidence, one truth remained terrifyingly clear. Their presence was still felt, even if unseen, and the possibility of further manipulation loomed over everyone in the room. The discovery of the storage unit had confirmed what Romy had feared for years. The family member no one talked about was not only real, but it played a pivotal role in shaping the tragedy. Their intelligence, patience, and capacity for control had allowed them to manipulate events over time, creating a scene that was as much a message as a crime. Romy's foresight, insight, and courage had provided a pathway for understanding, but the danger remained, and the narrative was far from complete. And as the investigators prepared to move deeper into the unit, exploring the documents, photographs, and subtle arrangements left behind, they realized that the true extent of this family member's influence, and the final revelations awaiting them, would challenge everything they thought they knew about trust, loyalty, and danger. But what came next, the hidden evidence, the connections, the truth, would upend the narrative entirely, leaving no one unshaken.